Hi, this is David again, and welcome to part 2 of my course on music theory. We talked about scales and keys and how we have a 12-tone division of the octave, which is the base, the root of everything in music, and how the major scale pattern picks certain notes out of that for both the major and the minor keys. Now the question is, what notes do we pick to make chords? So we're going to talk about what's called triad. A triad is the simplest kind of chord. We're going to talk about what chords you use in a given key. And we're going to talk about the association between the chords that you can use in a key and the notes in the key. And we're going to talk some structural things about chords and about basic alterations, making more interesting and more exotic chords. A chord is a set of at least 3 notes. Now there can be a lot of notes. Most of the time there's fewer than 6, but there has to be 3 or greater. And the most basic kind of chord is one that has exactly 3 notes, and that's called a triad. And remember, because you've got 3 notes, you've got 2 intervals. You've got a distance between the bottom note, usually the root, and the third, as it's called, and then a distance between the middle note and the top note, usually called the fifth. And the most important thing about all this is really how simple it is. Most everything in music is either a major chord or a minor chord. Now, it could be a major 7 or a minor 7 or a minor 9, but the major and minor is really, really important. It's also really obvious to the human ear. Well, guess what? It's trivial. A major chord starts with what's called a major third interval, which is 4 frets, followed by a minor third interval, which is 3 frets. A minor chord is the opposite. It starts with a minor third interval, 3 frets, and is followed by a major third interval, which is 4 frets. Here's the triad for a C major chord. C, E, G are the notes. And you can see, if you can read music, that that's what it says, from middle C up to G. It's a triad because it has 3 notes and they're the right structure. But that's all there is to a C major chord. You just take those 2 intervals. Now, why does it not look more complicated? Because a lot of times on the guitar, guitarists are playing 5 or 6 string versions, but they contain these notes, and that's what makes it a C chord. So, a minor triad, again, is a minor third followed by a major third. So the triad for C minor has C, E flat, and G. And if you finger those out on the guitar, you'll see that there's 3 frets between C and E flat, and 4 frets between E flat and G. And that's what makes it minor, that first interval being just a minor third, that is to say 3 frets, versus the first interval being a major third, or 4 frets, distinguishes major and minor. Now, because we have multiple strings and multiple notes, a guitar is a polyphonic instrument, meaning it's able to play more than one sound. But to make a big chord, what we often do is simply add the same notes back in different octaves. This is called doubling. And if you look at the chord frame on here, this is how I generally play a C chord. There's a lot of ways to play them, but this is my favorite, and I've played it this way for 50 years. So, but notice that there's 6 notes. Well, what are they? Well, they're 2 copies each of C, E, and G in 2 different octaves. There's a low C and a high C, a low G and a high G, and a low E and a high E. This is called doubling, and it means that it's really just a double triad. That's all I'm playing. So here we go with some of the most important stuff you'll ever learn about music. For most musical purposes, the notes allowed in a song are exactly those of the scale, whether it's major or minor. Those are the ones that are going to be sung. Those are the ones that are going to be written on the page. And even if it's an instrumental or whatever, the notes allowed are the ones from that scale. And there's a lot of exceptions to this, jazz, some of the blues. But for all practical purposes, this is the thing you want to tattoo on the top of your brain. If I'm in B flat, the notes of the melody are going to be from B flat, and the chords are going to be constructed from notes in that key of B flat. Now, given the rules that we have for how to construct major and minor triads, let's go through the scale, C, D, E, F, G, and so on, and try to build triads and see which ones we're allowed to build given the major scale pattern. So in the middle of this slide, you see some notes, and you have C, E, G. Why is that? Well, that's because those 3 notes exist and they're a third apart, but you have a major third at the bottom. So that's a C major chord. The next note over has a low note of D, a next note of F, and a next note of A. So it's D, F, A. Well, the D to F distance is 3 frets. That means it's got a minor third, and F to A is a major third. So it starts with a minor third and ends with a major third. That's a minor chord. And since it's rooted in D, it's D minor. And you work your way up the scale, and you find, intriguingly, that there's really only one exception, and that's at the 7th position. We'll talk about that a little more later. But if you read them from left to right in these triads, it's C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished, or G7. Think of it as G7. I'll explain why later. And C, you're back to C. In Roman numerals, it's, as you can read, 1, 2 minor, 3 minor, 4, 5, and so on. If you don't see anything after the letter like C or the number like 5, that means it's major. So the idea here is there's a set of associated chords that can be easily constructed from the key, and the set of notes, and the melody comes from the notes, and the accompaniment comes from the chords that are allowed to exist in that key. Now, I'm going to use the word allowed a bunch. It doesn't mean you're going to die if you play some other chord or that you have some other note. Simply that 99 times out of 100, when it comes time to change keys or it comes time to write another phrase in the song, the notes in those chords or the notes in that phrase are going to come from the major scale of the song, of the key that you're in right now. I call this the chord per note idea. And that is that for every note there's a corresponding chord, and for every chord there's a corresponding note, and that's the root note. Once again, the pattern of the major scale is all important. That means you start anywhere you want and you skip 2 frets, 2 frets, 1 fret, 2 frets, 2 frets, 1 fret, and you have made a major scale. If you do that in D, as I said in the previous video, you wind up making a D major scale. But you're limited into what you can do here because the fundamental definitions of the basic triads are major triad, minor triad. Major triad is a major third interval followed by a minor third interval. That is to say 4 frets followed by 3 frets. Minor is 3 frets followed by 4 frets. When you're building chords, you need to think about the intervals that are involved. And I like to think of them in Roman numerals. Other people don't. The main reason to think of them in Roman numerals is if you were to play these basic triads in C and then play them in F, you would hear that they're different, but you'd hear that their musical relationships were the same. And I'm big on trying to simplify life by thinking of the relationships. And what you'll find is that if you work out these chords per note, every note has its chord, and you do that in 2 keys, and then you play those chords in sequence or backwards or in whatever order you want, you'll find that what you've done is transpose the same musical idea into a different key. It's really not that hard. So now you know what a triad is. It's the simple 3 basic notes that make up major and minor chords. It's the heart of music. Very little in music is independent of the triads. Those are just everywhere in every song. A lot of things float on top of the triads like frosting on a cake, but the triads are the cake. Now, I can take a song, I can take a key like C, and I can play the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and then I can play the chords that go along with those notes. And that's the chord per note, and that's really important in how you to know, because most music, once again, most songs are composed using the notes of the key that they're in and very little else, maybe an occasional excursion, but almost always the notes, maybe in another octave also, but the same notes of the major scale, and the chords that you play along with it are composed of those same notes. So if I'm playing a song in C, every one of those chords that I just played has notes that are only in the key of C. They may be in some other keys, but they're definitely in the key of C. So I think of it like this. I've got a set of rules that tell me my chord construction, my scale pattern, 2-2-1, 2-2-2-1, and I have my triad construction rules. I intersect those two, and that tells me what I can write in terms of melody and what I can do in terms of accompaniment. And now we'll move on. Now, there's more to chords construction than most guitar players are aware. Music literature is full of that stuff. I don't mess with that, but you're often going to hear the term inversion. And all an inversion means is you've taken the set of notes that are supposed to be in that chord and you've simply inverted the order. Like here it's C, E, G. That's the root. The first inversion is E, G, C. The second inversion is G, C, E, and so on. Guitarists don't usually mess with inversions. We think in terms of block chords. These can be very useful if you're doing an instrumental or if you're trying to accompany things, but I'm not going to get into that. These forms are just alternate ways of playing the same chord. My approach is simple. When I build chords, I think of the notes that I need to play as a bag of notes. As long as I come up with a fingering that plays the notes that are needed and no more and no less, I can play them multiple times in different octaves or even in the same octave if my fingers are long enough. I'm going to get a good chord. I'm going to get a chord that works. I call that bag of notes. I don't care what inversion it's in, just let me play those notes the same way. Some note orderings, that is to say chords, will sound better than others. Usually, if you're supposed to play a C chord, if the low note is C or G, that's going to sound better than if the low note is E. But it isn't a hard and fast rule. So you'll hear about inversions, but I don't waste much time worrying about them. Now, let's start talking about basic alterations to chords. The first big thing you got to keep in mind all the time is a chord major or is it minor? And that is to say, start on the root and look at the next note. If it's 3 frets, that's minor. If it's 4 frets, that's major chord. Chords beyond major or minor, beyond the basic triads, require more than 3 notes. And the most common chord type is known as the dominant seventh. And all sevenths are 4-note chords because you're going to get the 1, the 3, the 5, and the 7 in various forms. So in Roman numerals, the pattern for the dominant seventh chord is, as you see, 1, 3, 5, flat 7. Now, why is it flat 7? Well, we're going to get into that in a minute. In the key of C, there's only one chord you can play that has that pattern and all of its notes go into the key of C's pattern, and that is G7. And that's G, B, D, and F. There is no other seventh chord that will do that. For example, if you started with C, you would get C, E, G, and B flat, but B flat's not in C. So C7 is not usually allowed in the key of C. Do you see it sometimes? Sure you do. It's there for color. But most of the time, it's not that common. And the chords that you use are the ones that we saw in the chord per note, where you, instead of using B diminished, you use G7, because actually, if you look at those notes there, B, D, F, that's the triad we had at the very end. That's the seventh triad in the key of C. You just put a G at the bottom and presto magico, you have a G7 chord. Now, there are some chords that have notes that are technically not in the key, that are reasonably common. When I say allowed, I don't mean absolutely it's forbidden to use anything else, merely that you need to recognize what to expect. And your highest expectation, the highest probability, is it's going to be one of those 7 basic chords from the chord per note pattern. C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, G7. But when you do have chords that have notes that are not in the key, there's some pretty common choices there too. And the primary choices are the sevenths made from the minors. So in C, you've got 3 minor chords in the chord per note, A minor, D minor, and E minor. If you just play their sevenths, A7, D7, E7, you'll find that if you play those, the 3 majors, C, F, and G, the 3 minors, A minor, D minor, and E minor, the 3 sevenths, A7, D7, E7, now we're talking 99.7% of all the songs ever written use those 9 chords. The next most common one, which I consider just a variation on C, is to play the 1-7, that's to say the C7 chord, root 7th. Every one of these chords has a single note that is not in the key. So it's close, but no cigar. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about sevenths. Again, they're 4-note chords which have the pattern 1, 3, 5, flat 7. Why is it flat 7 when we just call it 7? Well, the fact is that for many, many years, going back to the medieval church music when they began to do polyphony, they added that 7th note because they were doing the dominant 7th. In the key of C, they would play the G chord, they would add the F, and then they would resolve back to the C. And so they just call that the 7th. In fact, all the numbers that you read, whether it's 9th or 13th or 4 after the end of a chord name, are supposed to be counted from the root of the chord, right? So if I'm starting in G and I look what the 7th is actually F sharp. But the convention is, and it's totally just a convention that everybody sort of does, when you have a naked 7, that means add the flatted 7th of that key to the chord. And this is commonly called the dominant 7th because the 5th has another name, and that is the dominant. Minor 7th chords have a different pattern. This is where you have 1 flat 3, 5, flat 7. An example is A minor 7th, right? Which would be A, E, G, C. Or A, C, G, E, whichever one you want to do. The so-called major 7th is the real 7th. It's the one that has 1, 3, 5, 7, the natural 7. Why do we call it the major 7? Because the name 7 was already taken by the flatted 7th. And notice it has a natural 7th tone, which means that its notes, 1, 3, 5, 7, are actually in the key of C. There's no flatted 5th, which would be B flat. It has a natural 7th, which is B. If we start at 1, the root, in the example of C, it's just C, and build these 4-note 7th chords that are allowed, we only get 1 7th, that is to say flatted 7th. We get a couple of major 7ths. But here is the chord per note for 4-note chords. And I'm going to read them off from C. C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G7, A minor 7, and then B diminished or G7, depending on how you want to fry that bacon. But every one of the notes in these chords is allowed in the key of C, so they're all going to work well together. Remember, the rule of thumb is you take the major scale pattern and all the notes of the melody, most of the notes when you improvise, and virtually all the notes in the chords all come from just those notes. So this is the end of my second phase of the talk, and the main thing I want to emphasize here is I try to build a structure where I have a small number of rules for how to build chords, like major versus minor, and a rule for how to build a scale, the major scale, and everything in music theory is the intersection of those two ideas. Thanks a lot. Well, that was a lot of information. I hope that helped. Again, it's unfortunate that some of the terminology in Western music is not as clear as it could be. Like instead of calling it a step, we call it a half step. And we call the numbers 1 through 8 differently than what they would be if we were using really a 12-tone scale. But also the idea of a 7th chord. When I say a 7th chord, like if I say G7, I add the F note to make the 7th. But if I were really counting it correctly, in the key of G, I would be using the sharp 7, which is actually a major 7. But the rule is, for better or for worse, if it just says 7, it means use the flat 7 of that key, which brings me to emphasize that when you're putting those numerals there, those numerals apply to the major scale of the root of the chord. Doesn't matter what key you're in. So a G7th in C is the same as a G7th in B flat. It's the same as a G7th in F. It's the same chord all the time because it's always measured against the major scale of the root note. When you want to make 7ths and stay within the constraints of the major scale, there's only 1 7th you can make, and that is on the 5 tone, you can make the 5-7 chord. Okay. In C, that is G7, and that's all you can make. You can try all day long, but if you want to do 1, 3, 5, flat 7, starting at any note, anywhere, there's only 1 7th you can make, and that's it. That's why that chord and none of the others is in the chord per note pattern. So when I'm thinking in terms of learning a song. I'll listen to the song and I'll try to find a note. Okay, there's an E. Now, once I've got an E, in general, I want to try to see what chord that is. Well, it could be A, it could be E, it could be C, but I need to know if it's major or minor. So if it's major or minor, remember the triads only have 3 notes. Therefore, E can only occur in 3 major triads. Those major triads are A, E, and C. I listen to try which one of those. Then once I've got that, now I know that almost certainly the chord that I just found, let's say that it's A, is either going to be the key that I'm in, or it's going to be one of the other keys that has A in it. Okay, and there's really only going to be 3 that have A in them, and that's going to be D and A and E. So the key of A has an A chord, obviously. The key of D has the chord A as its 5th, and the key of E has the A chord as its 4th. So once again, if I know the chord, I know that it's only going to probably exist in 3 keys. So I've gone from hearing one note, finding one chord, figuring out it's in one of 3 keys, and then I play a couple of other chords in that key and see if that works. Or you can noodle around in that scale and see if it fits the melody. And that's how I learn songs when I'm confused. I hear a lot of things straight off the bat these days, but most of the time of my life I've had to go back to these fundamentals. So I call these chords the magic 9, because there's 3 majors, 3 minors, and then I take the 7ths of those 3 minors and I put them together. So let's take C for example. In C, the 3 majors are C, F, and G. The minors are A minor, D minor, and E minor. The 7ths, once again associated to the minors, are A 7th, D 7th, and E 7th. That's 9 chords. And if you know what key it's in, 99% of all your chords are going to be one of those 9. And that's really all you have to know. And you don't even try beyond the first 6, because the first 3 are major, and you can tell major from minor, so you know which of those 3 to go. And you only try the other ones when the majors and minors, simple majors and minors, don't work. So I'm going to show one more thing in this little piece of video, and that is the 4-note pattern for chord per note. And it starts with C major 7th, D minor 7th, E minor 7, F minor 7, G7, A minor 7, and B diminished, and then returning to C. Those all work because they're all notes in the scale. And we're going to talk about diminished in a minute.